first, second, or so, as I assumed that I was arriving in time to enroll in school at Howard. I hadn't made an application, and I thought I was arriving in time to just walk up on the campus and enroll. And when I arrived, I learned that, of course, it wasn't done that way. I had made an application. School had been in session for 3 weeks when I arrived, but I was persistent and refused to leave campus and insisted that I had to enroll. Um, I sat in on the classes and acted as though I was in college. And they finally, uh, being patient with me, and said, look, if you'll just wait until January when the next quarter begins, we'll officially enroll you. And I took that advice, but I still attended classes as though I were enrolled, wrote home and told everybody I'm in college. Well, January comes, and I then go up and officially enroll, and I think I enrolled in about 3 classes, none of which uh, was an art class. And I was going to pursue a major in history. And I pursued that course of study for 2 years, actually, before deciding to take an art course. The idea of taking an art course was that I was going to be in art, having a minor curriculum in art. And I was majoring in European history. And I'd taken all these history courses. The question was, what was I going to do with them once I really decided that I wanted more art? But I took an art course with James Wells in the spring, as I recall, of 1952. And he was teaching drawing, and that was one of the beginning courses that one had to take. Um, I noticed that at one time when I was drawing, there was a gentleman who came in the classroom whom I had not met and stood over me and asked what's my name, and I told him, and he looked at my drawing and looked at me, and he said, "What is your major?" And I told him my major was history, and he simply said to me, "Well, you don't belong over there, you belong here." And this was James A. Porter. It was my first introduction to him. I may have seen him before on campus, but I didn't know him per se. He introduced himself and told me who he was. And I went immediately and changed my major and took no more history courses. Then I started taking um, courses in the visual arts and art history, and of course completed the rest of my requirements in the Department of Art, as well as in the college at large, or the university at large, the College of Liberal Arts. Now, my teachers were James Porter, who then became my mentor, studying painting with him, oil painting, that is, and because the painting was divided along media lines. James Porter taught oil painting, Lois Jones taught watercolor painting, and we all wanted to gravitate to Lois's class, but we had to get our official requirements out of the way because her classes were considered advanced classes. So I was anxious to get through my elementary classes in painting and drawing and printmaking. James Wells taught the printmaking. So I could get to watercolor painting because it seemed that everybody in Lois's class had more fun. They also went out to her house and painted. She had a studio over in the 1200 block of Quincy Street where she lived. And my colleagues, fellow students would come back bragging about having gone to Lois's classes, and they were like being in Paris. People wore berets and so forth. And I wanted to get out there. And Porter, of course, said, no, you can't go out there. You're my student. And so I didn't go. I missed out on that. But as it would turn out, when I took watercolor painting, I'm sure I impressed Lois with my facility at painting. And she would always single me out as literally the best student in the class. In those days, you could do that without conflict. And she would have a critique at the end of every class session, and she would award prizes. I would almost always win first prize. So I became teacher's pet, so to speak. So Lois took a liking to me, even though I was not, quote, her student. And this pursued for, I guess, maybe a year and a half, when I was asked by James Porter in the spring of 1953, and by that time I had been married for over a year. Um, and we had one child, Thelma and I had one child, Davreen. And I was asked by Porter, what are you going to do this summer? And I said, I have to work. And I was driving a taxi and working at an art store. And he said nothing else. The next thing I knew, I was being called on the carpet by him maybe a month later. And he said, you told me that you were going to work this summer. Now Miss Jones says that she comes up with the notion that you should go to Skowhegan. And I'm caught in the middle of this thing. I knew students had gone to Skowhegan but didn't know very much about it. And I think prior to that time, mostly our graduate students had gone to Skowhegan. So I said, well, I think I can go. And he explained to me that this had caused some conflict in the faculty meeting because he said I couldn't go, Miss Jones said I could. And so I went. I was then exposed to Skowhegan. That was the summer of 1953. Prior to that time then, I had taken oil painting courses, I had taken watercolor courses, I had taken design, I had taken printmaking and drawing, so I was pretty much equipped to, I would say, to compete with the rest of the students. And they came from the art academies, like the Pennsylvania Academy of Arts, the Students' League, the Rhode Island School of Design, and few universities, as I recall, were a part of that program. The Art Institute of Chicago, I remember in particular, Robert Indiana, who was Robert Clark at that time, was the scholarship student from the Art Institute of Chicago. James McGarrell and Alex Katz and Tom Buterson, many other names, Jack Wallace, and people who have gone on to distinguish themselves as major American artists. We were all there in that class that summer. And the courses in painting were being taught by Sidney Simon, who later became a sculptor, and Jack Levine. And I gravitated to Jack Levine because I wanted to become a social commentary artist. And my art thereafter, after leaving Skowhegan, reflected a slight posture of trying to paint people in social settings. The sculptor that summer was Milton Hebald, and some of the visiting artists were William Zorak. Kuniyoshi was supposed to come, and he died about a month before he was to appear. Henry von Empoor taught fresco painting, and they were the principal faculty. Now, Bill Cummings was there, the principal founder of the school, on whose land the school was located. And I made a friendship with him and his family. And it became an enduring friendship over the years, which eventually resulted in my becoming rather involved with the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture as a resident artist, as a governor, as a trustee, and now as an advisor, a member of the advisory board. So getting back to Skowhegan, I left Skowhegan with a sense of confidence, having met students from all around the world. At that time, and it was an international school, students from Italy and places like that. I won the prize, the Beaucourt Prize in painting, which was given for the student who seemingly made the most progress that summer. So Skowhegan kept a painting of mine called Tiger Lilies, which is in the collection there. Um, my roommate was Walter Williams. We became good friends. We were the only two black students there that summer. Skowhegan had made an effort to always be diverse, and Howard University had a full scholarship, and that, of course, helped. Walter was from the Brooklyn Museum School of Art. They were students from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, etc. So there was a wide distribution of students from around the country. So I got that kind of universal or international exposure. This was the first time I had been traveled north of Baltimore. I took the train all the way to Waterville, Maine, changed trains in Boston, stayed overnight, and came through Portland and on up to Waterville, was met by the gentleman in the pickup truck, I don't recall his name, who took me immediately to Skowhegan. And I had not been exposed to shellfish and things like that. My first debut with lobster, and I wouldn't eat it. And I would go to the cafeteria and ask Mrs. Harville, who was the dietitian, to prepare me a hamburger or an egg for dinner. And the first couple of times she did. About the third time they had lobster, and I went in and asked if she would prepare me a hamburger. And she said, "No, David Driskell, have you ever eaten lobster?" And I said, "No, I don't eat those things." She said, "Well, then you don't know what it tastes like." So she said, "If you eat anything today, you're going to eat lobster. I'm not preparing you anything else." So I had to try lobster. I tried it, I loved it, and I've been eating it ever since. So that was a part of my Skowhegan experience. I think what Skowhegan did for me was expose me to the larger art world in a way that I never could have been exposed before. I met friends, people, made contacts that are still in place. Uh, I met a young lady by the name of Ann Steinbrocker, and she and Walter Williams won first prize together that year. Normally it's just one person, but they won first prize in painting. And Ann gave me a ride back to New York, and she wanted me to see New York City before I went to Washington. She was a very, very kind and dear person, and she hired a taxi to take me all over New York City over that 2-day period. At night, she took me to Harlem. Um, we saw we didn't go in, but we stopped off at some of the famous clubs that were still in existence at that time. The Red Rooster. She drove past the Cotton Club, or what was the Cotton Club, and places like that. The Apollo Theater up and down 125th Street. And then she had the taxi drive me down Broadway. She wanted me to see the lights of Broadway, back past down Fifth Avenue, past St. Patrick's Cathedral, and all these places made an impression in my mind. When I returned to Washington, I had the memory of those places, and I painted a composition called Boy with Birds, which kind of celebrated my visit to the city. In some sense, it's autobiographical, even though it was like a newspaper boy. And I had been a newspaper boy. When I was in elementary school, I delivered the Grit newspaper, which printed news a month after it had happened. Because we were so isolated in Appalachia, it was news to us, and I would take it to my 3 or 4 customers. Paper sold for 5 cents, and I would get a percentage of that. So that newspaper boy in that painting is really me, but I've transposed myself to the city. We drove just a little beyond Harlem, and as though you were entering the Bronx, and you could see the L, not the L, but the streetcars, not the streetcars, but the subways, as they emerge from the subterranean area. And so in that painting, you will see these L-like structures of where the streetcar is moving past. So I also, upon return to Washington, painted a composition um, called St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it was in a glaze. I was experimenting with what Professor Porter called the Tanner blue and green glazes. I don't know where that painting is today, but it probably emanated from my look at the work of Henry O. Tanner and pursuing that process of glazing. Those two paintings in particular came out of the New York experience. Then that fall, later in the fall, I did a painting called City Quartet, in which I tried to emulate the style of Jack Levine, chiaroscuro painting from dark to light. Heavy umber layer first, then after raw umber, burnt umber, then after burnt umber, the siennas, and until you come up with just a touch of yellow ochre, something like that in a painting. And as Levine always said, there was no such thing as cadmium yellow and all of that in those days when Rembrandt painted. And he said you could glaze all the way up and make that painting with yellow ochre look like it was a touch of gold. And that's what I was trying to do with. And another painting I did called Boy with Bow. I don't know where that is. It was in the Barnett Aiton collection, in which I used the same technique. And I even used kind of grotesque faces and figures trying to emulate what I saw in Levine's work. That style followed me into the end of my career at Howard. When I returned also in the fall of 1953, Morris Lewis was teaching painting at Howard University. And Porter insisted that I take a course with Morris Lewis. Well, I evaded it the first semester. I did not want to take a course with Morris Lewis because he was a total abstractionist. And I wasn't into abstraction. I was going to solve all the problems of the world by being a social realist painter or a social commentary artist. And so at the end of the first semester, by then we were on the semester system at Howard, and to the spring semester, Porter didn't ask me if I wanted to take. He simply said, "You're going to take a course with Morris Lewis." And I did. And that's when the concept of modernism began in my work. I started painting in large passages of flow. Howard University has a painting of mine, I think it's called Spring or something like that. And they are blocks of painting, not cubistic blocks, but just plain blocks, almost Milton Avery style. I didn't know Avery's work at that time, but this was the influence that Lewis had on me. And another work, at the same time, I was trying to pursue the Figaro tradition. And there's a painting that I did, I think that same spring, in which I all but copied Jackson Pollock with all kinds of drips of paint, but it was still Figaro. It was called Feast of the Gods. And it was the largest painting that I had done until that time. It was about 40 by 60, and I think it's still in the collection at Howard. I recall the anatomy professor, Dr. Cobbs, from the School of Medicine coming over, taking a look at it once, and he talked about the anatomical structure that was so evident in that painting, even though it's supposed to be abstract expressionist. Well, that brings me to around 1954. So the year 1955 was my last year at Howard taking painting courses. And I took another course with Lois, an advanced watercolor painting course. And but I was still Porter's student, so to speak. James V. Herring was the chairman of the art department at that time. And the only course I took with him was one called Art Appreciation. All the other courses were taken with Porter, Lois Jones, uh, James Wells, Lila Asher, who taught drawing, and I forget the professor's name another professor who taught art history. Um, the courses were divided along the lines of art history and art studio. Porter was the only one who taught both art history and studio. And I wanted to pattern myself after him. I liked the notion that he was so learned. He'd get up and teach his history classes without looking at a note. Of course, he used his own text, Modern Negro Art. So I all but memorized that book so I could be as conversant about it as he when he was teaching. But interestingly enough, I was the only person in the class in 1952, 53 when he taught the course, Modern Negro Art. At that time, I did not take a course in African art. He also taught courses in African art history. And I understand some of his advanced students also took courses in African history with Leo Hansberry and people like that. Well, I didn't. But I was enrolled in what we call the humanities seminar, which really was a course that met 2 days a week with a humanities teacher and 1 day in the chapel where we'd all come together. And it's there that I was first exposed to Alan Locke, who was a lecturer in that class. He was a philosophy professor, but he'd also written extensively on art, perhaps characterized by some as the first major African-American art historian. Of course, that designation did not set too well with Herring, who had founded the art department at Howard University and who was in constant conflict with Locke over something. And Locke and Porter didn't always agree on their approach to what we would call today African-American art history. Porter wanted to see art history from the perspective, African-American art history, from the perspective of an American experience, of not so much our having retentions that went all the way back to Africa, even though he pointed many of those out, but he did not feel that our talent was necessarily based on that kind of latent Renaissance notion of rebirth. It was in with us and so forth. Whereas Locke wanted to see this concept of the legacy of African art continued, and which meant that one would all but copy the motifs of masks and statuary art and what have you. Porter disagreed with that from the very beginning and felt that that would produce a superficial element of Africanity. So that was a debate that ensued for a number of years. I think in later years, before Locke died in 1954, they had come to a meeting of the minds on the subject, and the idea was, well, it's good both ways, and both were winners in that sense. And it's interesting, Herring never really got into that debate. He never wrote a book, but he wrote articles on African American craftspeople and so forth. And he would avoid that issue by simply saying that it was native craftsmanship, or they were influenced by certain trends, environmental conditions, and so forth and so on. So Howard then really was the only place in the world where one could study African and African American art history as a unit. There were some other universities like Northwestern, and uh, Boston, where one could study African art as ethnographic materials, as ethnology. But it was not really pursued as a course in the fine arts tradition of art history. And so, in that sense, Howard was really way ahead of its time, way ahead of many other universities, and produced students who later took that attitude with them when they left Howard to go to other places to work. And it was the Howard University students principally who left Howard to go to the HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities, to set up art departments in those schools in the South. Lincoln University in Pennsylvania was the only private school of that type that was predominantly black. Cheney State University was black, but it was a state school in Pennsylvania. And so numerous people went to those various schools, many of them from Howard, to teach, and they took with them very much the Howard philosophy, the curriculum that was pretty much in place when I was a student there.